Hello and welcome to the British Sitcom History Podcast. My name is Alan. With me, as always, is Gareth.
Hello.
And this week, we are going back to the future. Does that make sense? We are going to the most recent thing we've ever done. Almost the present day. We're only a year out of date here because we're looking at Ghosts.
Ghosts, the modern sitcom Ghosts. This was my suggestion. I really love Ghosts, not to tip my hand too much. And I've been trying to talk Alan into doing this for quite a while. But you were adamant that we couldn't do a sitcom that hadn't finished. Yeah. That was your definition of sitcom history, which is reasonable. Yeah, so now they've announced they're not making any more. I managed to persuade you to do it.
Yeah, or at least reasonably thinking it had finished. Like if something comes back after 10 years, that's a different thing, isn't it? But yeah, we are the British Sitcom History Podcast, and personally, that is not just a sort of a philosophical position. It's just because I haven't watched telly for 20 years. I don't know what's on. But yeah, I do like to kind of have the historical context of things and kind of put them in their place. And usually, you want a bit of time to analyze that and kind of look back and where it sits. But I've really enjoyed the kind of Fleabag, for example, like things that I hadn't seen before, and I have missed 20 years of TV. I just like it's okay to pick out the gems.
I think there's a danger in nostalgia, and we are, but to some extent, a nostalgic podcast. We're looking at the past with affection. We review Rising Damp and Porridge, and it's very easy to fall into that trap of saying, the sitcoms these days, they're rubbish, they're not like they used to be. But number one, there was a lot of crap in the 70s as well, and we've looked at some pretty ropey sitcoms from the past as well, so it's not all good stuff. And number two, there is some good stuff out now, and Ghosts is the example I always use when I'm having this conversation.
Yeah, and obviously being a good show is not a prerequisite for us to look at it. That's not the point of what we do. But those are the ones that tend to glisten in the mud. But yeah, overview, we both really like this show. And I think that's important because that's kind of what it's about. Ghosts is a nice show for everybody, right?
It's a family-friendly show. I've watched this with my partner's kids who are 9 and 12, and they think it's great. They think it's really funny. My son who's 18 thinks it's really funny.
Yeah, I feel like I could watch this with my parents, and that would be fine. We, like I was saying, we look back on old TV and we kind of, what's the difference? We're picking out nostalgia or whatever. But the world of TV has changed quite considerably.
Sure.
Over the last few decades. And the makeup is much more disparate now. We are not looking at the same kind of shows that are being successful or even being made in the first place. For logistical reasons, as well as the general changing of fashions.
I also think it's interesting that, like, if I look at the recent sitcoms that I've enjoyed, I would recommend We Are Lady Parts, Chewing Gum, that's a few years old, Everyone Else Burns. I've really enjoyed those sitcoms in recent years. But they're all not for families. Like, they're all adult shows. Whereas Ghosts is more in that old sitcom tradition of the whole family could sit around the TV and watch this.
Which I think is a very old tradition. It doesn't feel like that's something that's been around for a while because we don't have 3 channels anymore. We don't have to all sit around the television and watch it. You can go on the other room and watch on a different television, or you just watch it online. But this is important to Ghosts because this was one of the founding positions of Ghosts as a show. The creators sort of sat down and said, what can we do to create a family-friendly sitcom like back when we were kids? So I really wanted to kind of put that idea down straight away. That's what they were doing.
We're gonna do what we usually do and go through an episode, but for most of the cast and all the creative talent behind it, they've got a sort of common background. So why don't we address that first?
Yeah. So the group of actors who created this sitcom, they call themselves Them There. That's like their production name, company name. But that's something they've taken on very relatively recently just to have a sense of identity. But they've been working together for a while. It's an interesting backstory because, whenever we look at writing groups like this, an obvious kind of comparison here is Monty Python. Because they have been compared to them for their sketch work quite a bit. I don't know if I buy that. But anyway, the point is, like Monty Python, it was not an organic, hey, we're all buddies and let's write together. But it was two friends here, two people who worked well here, and they kind of came together and they got on, and the same background, blah, blah, blah.
Isn't there a distinction to be made here that the Monty Python guys were writers who ended up performing, rather than actors who then became writers?
Yes, this is very unusual, I think. But just the way this team was brought together in the first place, they were all comedy actors. They were all, working on the scene, on the comedy scene. And they were hired for Horrible Histories. This is, when was it, 2009 Horrible Histories started? Okay. So most of them were like late 20s, mid-30s, that kind of age range, working sketch comedians. Yeah. And fair enough. There's this book series called Horrible Histories. Kids love it. We want to do a kind of live version of it. We need some sketch comedians who have just got a lot of range. There were 7 people in Horrible Histories. So we have the 6... principal actors who are in this show and form the group that writes
so who's the 7th?
We'll go through them in a minute. But the 7th one, who were in the first couple of series of Horrible Histories as one of the regulars, was Sarah Hadland.
Oh, wow. Sarah Hadland, who we saw as Miranda's friend.
Yes, who left Horrible Histories because she got the Miranda gig, basically.
Really? Oh, that's fascinating.
Well, if you think they both sort of came out about the same time, so she obviously Miranda was such a big hit that she was like, I can leave this kids show. That is
obviously the right choice to make. Do you carry on doing this kids show, or do you go for this mainstream? That's obviously the right thing to do. And what's she doing now? Oh, that's really unlucky.
And it's interesting that, that ended up with these 6 principal cast. And for anybody who's not sure... In fact, do you know what, Gareth? You have a child who's about the right age that would have enjoyed a Horrible Histories, right?
Oh, yeah.
So why don't you tell us what Horrible Histories is?
Well, Horrible Histories, you're absolutely right. I loved Horrible Histories. I used to watch it with Thomas when he was a kid. But one of those programs that, you enjoyed watching. Horrible Histories was a sketch show wherein they portrayed historical events, historical characters with a little bit of humour, but it was teaching history in an entertaining and funny way. And they'd always have little captions on the screen whenever a character would say something that sounded particularly ridiculous. They'd have a caption on screen saying, "This is really true," So they were teaching history. And my son still to this day says he learned more from Horrible Histories than he ever did at school.
Well, the way I've heard people talking about it is that it wasn't about teaching history particularly, although they kind of lay out some real things in the sketches. It was about making it fun and engaging so that you then kind of go, oh, I want to know more about this. Not maybe not even directly, oh, I'm going to go to the library and pick up a book about Henry II and learn more. But when you're in school and people are talking about history, you're just a little bit more like, oh, I've got a bit of context. This is a bit more engaging. Yeah. And just that kind of, they're giving them the gift the thirst for knowledge.
Oh my God.
Teach a man to fish, Gareth.
But it was genuinely funny. And as an adult, I found it funny. And didn't they win a British Comedy Award?
Yeah, I mean, they won all sorts of stuff. Yeah, I mean, I know Jim Howick, who's one of the actors, won specifically for his performing, but and they won, I don't know, I can't remember the full details, but comedy awards and children's BAFTAs and stuff like that, So, I mean, Horrible Histories did kind of exactly what it set out to. And from what I've heard the actors talking about it, it was a real kind of anarchic punk mentality because they were just cramming loads of stuff in. It's like you spend...
costumes and makeup and then on you go, quick.
You do about an hour filming a sketch where you're Henry VIII and then you've got to turn around and you're like, now you're death. And you're going to go, it's like stupid sketches.
If you haven't, then go onto YouTube and have a look at Horrible Histories bloopers, and it's basically just constant footage of Jim Howick making everybody laugh, and you think, God, you haven't got time for this, But they always seem to be having such a great time.
And that's very much what's come across when they're talking about it, and the fact that they're still working together many, many years later, because this relationship was forged in fire. They had to get on with each other and just kind of keep each other going because it was such kind of hard work. They had to make it funny. They had to just kind of keep going. And I think it was Matt Bainton, one of the actors, who said, like, you come in, you're this sketch comedian, you've been brought in for this kid. Within, like, the first 3 days, you've run out of your funny voices. You've run out of accents you can do. So then you just have to kind of keep, like, being inventive and doing stuff all the time. Yeah. So when Horrible Histories ended, or at least the first kind of iteration of it, it did come back later on. They did 5 series, I think, 5 years.
But it came back later with different people, didn't it?
Yes.
And that was after my son had grown out of it, so I didn't see him.
Yeah. So this main troupe, they kind of just went, well, we really like working together. Let's just keep working together. Let's throw some ideas together and see what we can do.
So what did they do next?
But but let's address what you mentioned earlier. These are not writers. They were all actors who were brought in, with the exception of Lawrence Rickard, who plays Robin in Ghosts. Mm-hmm. He was a writer. He was brought onto the Horrible Histories crew as a writer, but then he kind of wrote some things and he wanted to do them, or there was a specific character that nobody else could do, or whatever it was. But he sort of migrated into the acting troupe rather than the other way around. But all the others were
you said they were sort of sketch comedians, so they would have been writing sketches and that sort of thing.
Often probably writing their own sketches, and or in a little comedy double act, they're doing Edinburgh Fringe, all that kind of stuff. It's interesting that they all got together and decided to write together. And fair enough, right? If they want to give it a go.
We enjoy working together. Look, we think we can do it. Let's do it.
But perhaps more surprising is that it actually worked and they've gone on to be successful.
Yeah, well, that's fair, yeah.
And so their next big project was a show called Yonderland.
Now, I didn't enjoy Yonderland. I watched Yonderland on the basis of, it's a Horrible Histories crew. And I think we only got 2 or 3 episodes in. Thomas didn't like it. We weren't into it. And we just sort of let it go. It was basically Horrible Histories, but in a fantasy world with Muppets, right?
Yeah, it's a fantasy thing, and there's kind of a lot of. It put me in mind of a bit of Mighty Boosh vibe, because there's kind of they're just doing silly voices and lots of different characters. They're all playing lots of different characters, and didn't have quite the same anarchic style, but that kind of fantasy element. And a quite deliberately like lo-fi style with all these puppets, these kind of old school puppets that you don't really see much.
Like Muppets, yeah.
I mean, I watched some bits of it. I didn't connect with me. I don't know. It's not for me. It is still aimed at a kind of a youth audience.
I'd be very interested to know if any of our listeners really enjoyed Yonderland. I've never really talked to anyone about it. I guess it's a sitcom, isn't it? It's a sitcom of sorts, but like I say, I love all the people involved. I love what they did before. I love what they've done afterwards. So it's just odd that I didn't really click with that.
It ran for a few series, so I don't think it was like a failure. And
was it on Sky? I think it was on Sky.
It was on Sky, which obviously
always reduces the audience.
Yeah, but fair enough. It was successful enough that they got a few more years' work out of it, and again, still held on to enough cachet to be able to pitch their next idea. In the meantime, as well, they created a film. They did a film as well called Bill,
about Shakespeare, right? Now, I watched this film recently because I'd never seen it before, and basically it was, what if the Horrible Histories lot did Shakespeare for an hour and a half?
Yeah.
But I really enjoyed it. It was great. It was like a long Horrible History sketch. It was really good. You had Ben Wilbon doing a really camp King Philip of Spain. It was just great. Jim Howick's always great, no matter what wig he puts on. I really enjoyed it. It made me laugh a lot.
Yeah, I watched it as well. Researching this, I thought that's an easy one for me to just sit down and watch. And didn't blow me away, but I enjoyed it. It was a bit of fun, silly. I think it didn't do very good business, but it kind of got caught up in a bit of, film business shenanigans. The company that were going to make it went out of business. Someone else bought it and then didn't market it. That kind of thing. It just kind of got lost in the mix, which is a bit weird. Like, the branding is there. It's the Horrible Histories crew. There's an audience there who are going to come and watch it. So if you're going to put it out, sell it. But anyway, this is the vagaries of the film world,
Sometimes it's just luck, isn't it?
It's all very dodgy. But, again, the film kind of came out well enough that people respect the work. And maybe that helps when you go into a production meeting at the BBC and say, hey, we've got an idea.
So can you tell us how Ghosts came about then? So they went back to the BBC. Like, how was it just simple as that? They pitched it and BBC bought it?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, they obviously came together and kind of threw ideas in, and that seems to be their way. The 6 of them, they just sit down and put ideas together. I suspect, I don't really know their process, but I suspect they do a lot of character-based R&D, research and development, as in they're like improving characters, because these characters are also kind of fit round their personal strengths,
Yes.
And they said by the point they were doing this, they'd been working together for so long that they all knew what they were best at, and like what they were good at.
I think if you go back after Ghosts and watch some Horrible Histories, you can definitely see those characters. You can see them in embryonic form.
Yeah. the basic concept of ghosts then, they were throwing ideas together. One of them was haunted house. Like, what's our sitcom basic? Haunted house, you know. That's your 2-word setup, right?
Yep.
That works, but what does that really mean? And then obviously at some point they fleshed that out. Can we talk about the whole setup before we kind of get into the show itself?
Yeah, okay. So the setup is this. Charlotte Ritchie plays a young woman who's got no family, and some very distant relative dies, and complete surprise, her and her husband, who's Kyle Smith Bino, they inherit this Button house, this old, broken down, derelict mansion house. And they go in and they decide they're gonna do it up. They're gonna maybe turn it into a hotel, B&B. Meanwhile, we have seen that this house is populated by ghosts, our characters. And the first episode is basically them all being appalled by these new people coming into their space. Then in that first episode, Charlotte Ritchie has a fall. She bangs her head. She's actually pushed by one of the ghosts, but that's a separate issue. She has this fall. She bangs her head, and I think we're sort of led to believe that she dies briefly and then comes back. And as a result of this accident, she can see all the ghosts. Not just these ghosts, but when she goes elsewhere, she can see all ghosts. Mm-hmm. And hilarity ensues.
Yeah, and it's a great setup. And just on the basis of haunted house, if we think about sitcom, what's your classic sitcom setup? It's basically a group of people stuck together who wouldn't normally choose to be together. They don't like each other necessarily, or they might do here and there, but, you know. So you have workplace sitcoms, you have family sitcoms. It's a group of mismatched people who are trapped together. And this is that. They become an uneasy family of sorts. They're all trapped together in this house for, in some cases, hundreds of years.
From different times, different levels of society. Just they're completely random characters,
different
from across the centuries,
all that kind of
all
stuff,
smashed together.
Yeah,
smashed together, like you say, for centuries. And
then I think that was their original concept, and then it was like, well, what does any of that mean? What are the stakes and all that kind of thing? So having a living couple there who are like, oh my god, we need to pay the bills, or like the house is falling down, like having some kind of real life stakes was the anchor that it needed. And that was kind of the missing ingredient. That's what they figured out. But just from a setup point of view, I think it's perfect for this group. Because the ghosts are these kind of comedy characters, these sketchy comedy characters. They're well fleshed out, like, don't get me wrong. And they've obviously all got this solid background that they've developed long before the first episode. But it means those characters can be a little bit out of a little bit bigger than life and wacky.
Yes, not
not too much, but just enough to be a sitcom characters. And then you've got these kind of real characters who are the anchors.
You've really hit the nail on the head there. That is it. They have got that dial turned to exactly the right level where they are realistic characters, but just that slight exaggeration.
Yes, but in a real world. Whereas, for example, maybe Yonderland is wacky characters in a wacky world. And then you kind of have the one sort of central straight character. And so, we have Alison and Mike. They're the couple who come and live in this kind of wacky world. And Alison is in it. And then you have this kind of double there where Alison is part of this world. And Mike is slightly detached because he can't see the ghosts. And so, to him, Alison is insane, or not in a very literal sense.
But we very quickly get past that, don't we? Like in the second episode, when she starts to see the ghosts, I can't remember how it happens, but he is now convinced that they are there. It doesn't take long before he stops thinking she's mad, and you know, so we get past that because that would just be awkward.
Yeah, and it's about as long as she thinks she's mad as well. She's sort of she's just imagining everything. Okay, well, I think I want to jump into the episode itself, and kind of start working from that, and then we can kind of talk about the different characters.
All right, let's do that. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about Series 4, Episode 4, Gone Gone. Which is, I'm going to spoiler it here. This is the episode where Mary gets sucked off.
Moved on.
So after the titles roll, we open with all the ghosts together, and it's just, another morning. And we see this is often a way that episodes open. The ghosts are just doing something. One of them is trying to entertain the others, and everyone is absolutely bored out of their minds because they've been doing this for hundreds of years. Yeah,
and this is central to the characters. It's not just a bit of comedy. They are a group of people stuck together with kind of no outside entertainment. We'll come back to that in a bit because Alison kind of changes their lives quite considerably. But they just got each other. They don't have anything in common, and they can't touch anything. They can't interact with anything. So they've got kind of their imaginations. There's
a great episode where Pat, the scoutmaster, is teaching everyone how to tie a knot without any rope. He's just describing a knot. It's terrific. But yeah, you've got to be pretty bored to get to that point.
Yeah, exactly. But that's the heart of these characters and why they've had to kind of rub along together, because it's just this most boring, mundane existence. But it's good writing. The reason I wanted to do this episode particularly is because it's quite a fundamental episode in the whole show that really deals with some basic concepts that they have. But also, it's just a great script. It's a great half-hour structure of how to write.
I think that this episode is one of the best examples of the thing I love most about Ghosts, which is it's got heart. It's got real emotion. It's funny, but it really tugs at the heartstrings. And this episode is dealing with grief, and all of the characters have got such emotional depth. It's really. This is why I think it's great. It's better than just good.
Yeah.
This opening scene transitions from just a sort of cold open introduction to the inciting incident for the whole program, which is they kind of go, oh, where's Robin? Where's Robin? And they start to worry that he's been taken up to the next stage. So we've had this set up previously where, as Mary describes it, people get sucked off, so that a light comes from the heavens and they ascend up, so they get sucked off. That's much hilarity. But they think, oh, Robin's been sucked off. And then he turns up. Oh, God, it's a big bait and switch. No, he's fine. He's there he is, after all. And then suddenly, the heavenly music plays, the light comes on, and Mary herself is moved on, sucked off.
Yes.
And they all watch their friend of hundreds of years just disappear in front of their eyes.
So can we talk about getting sucked off for a minute? Because this is something that, in the very first episode, we see the old lady who owns the house dying, and they're all it's the setup of what they are. They're all gathered round her deathbed. As she dies, a kind of spirit comes out of her body, and she can see them for the first time. They've been living with her all this time. And she kind of says, "Who are you?" And they say, "Oh, we're spirits trapped in this house." And then she kind of ascends to the heavens or whatever. But so that kind of sets that idea up, but it doesn't establish that they, as ghosts, may get moved. You either you either die and move on, or you don't.
Or you're stuck there.
Yeah.
Apparently indefinitely.
And then, in Series 2, we get a sudden and kind of unexpected reference to a woman called Annie. And it's in a flashback scene where they're telling stories of... It's called the Thomas Thorne Affair. It's about the particular character's backstory. And they're all telling their different stories, Rashomon style, of how he died. Yeah. And Mary suddenly goes, oh, yeah, so me and Annie were there, and we were chatting. And Alison goes, sorry, who's Annie? And they just go, oh, sorry, did we never tell you? Yeah, Annie was here. Yeah, she was here for about 120 years, something like that. And then she passed on. And, like... That's like in Series 2, and they just drop it in, never mention it again. I thought, that is so good. I just really liked this. Just like, oh yeah, there's been other ghosts here, and then they just never mentioned it again. But I think they were just, dropping that in as a kind of, we might be able to use this later on. Not necessarily this character, but establishing a bit of ghost lore. And they do decide to use it directly. So, the episode we're looking at here is Series 4, Episode 4. 2 episodes before that, we get a much deeper backstory of Mary and Annie's relationship and how Annie helped Mary find her voice and kind of stand up for herself a little bit before Annie herself moved on and Mary kind of misses her. And so they just bring that back, and it's kind of the basis for that episode, and it works just as its own episode. And then, like, 2 episodes later, it's suddenly like, oh, they just had to remind us of this kind of lore. They had to just kind of make sure we knew about this before they did.
Yeah, but it's nice writing because it doesn't feel forced.
No, it does not.
And it enables them, because it was Katie Wicks, who plays Mary, basically needed to go and do other things. And so they needed a way of writing her out.
Yeah. Can we just talk about Katie Wicks for a second?
We're jumping around a bit, but let's do that. Let's talk about Katie Wicks. So she's one of the actors who is not one of our Horrible Histories crew.
Yeah, so we have the 6 actors from the Horrible Histories crew. They all have a character each in the main cast, ghosts, plus Lawrence Rickard plays a secondary ghost. Well, maybe we'll talk about that a bit later on, but he is kind of a secondary ghost. So. Yeah. And then they've obviously thought, we need to expand this a bit. we are 5 white men and 1 white woman. Maybe we should. Yeah. So they've introduced 2 more women, and one of them isn't even white. Could you believe it?
Unbelievable.
But if you are going to be an all-white troupe in this day and age, do something set in history, British history. Just about get away with it. But anyway, so we have Katie Wicks and Lolly Adefope brought in as other principal ghosts characters, both of whom had worked on Horrible Histories in one way or another as kind of occasional guest actors and stuff like that. They were all connected. I don't think it was just random auditionees, But let's talk about Katie Wicks first.
Well, I've seen Katie Wicks in loads of things. Like she's one of those people who's been in, for example, she's been in Staff Lets Flats. So she's been in like fairly low key comedies, but then she pops up in like 1 or 2 episodes here and there of everything. She was in Miranda, wasn't she? We saw her in Miranda.
2 episodes of that, yeah. So my approach to this, I watched the show and I didn't really know anybody, and I'm not familiar with their earlier work. I'm not familiar with Horrible Histories and that sort of thing. So it was kind of all new to me. And then I kind of looked into them a little bit, and I looked at Jim Howick, and I was like, "Oh, it's that guy." I was watching like some Armstrong and Miller clips or something. I was like, "Oh, right, yeah, I do know that guy. I've seen him in loads of stuff."
Yeah.
And then, like upon investigation, like I've seen all these people in something. Like Simon Farnaby, I recognise, but like I didn't really know any of them. Katie Wicks was probably the one I knew the most, and perhaps because of that, my immediate thought was, "Isn't she a bit too good for this? Like, not in terms of quality, but just in terms of like, isn't she already
well established?"
Yeah, and like if she was, one of 4 in a sitcom, like in main roles, but this is like a 10-person ensemble, and she's kind of number 8 in that. You know what I mean? It's like not. I don't know. It never quite sat right, and I felt like she was a bit wasted. And like what she does is great. The character's good. It's fun, but it's like, she's bigger than this, isn't she? And I don't know if that's just my interpretation of it. But I have not heard from any interviews or anything like why she left specifically.
I've sort of, when I've been listening to interviews, the vibe was she'd had enough.
Yeah.
They didn't fall out, but had enough now.
And I get it, and especially if it's
that's all right, isn't it? That's reasonable.
Yeah, if it's like, there's maybe one episode of series where you really get focused on, and other times you're just sort of stood in the background going, "Oh, don't walk through me." Oh. It's I get it.
Can we talk about the character, actually? Because we're going to have to jump around. There's lots of characters here. So let's tick off Mary as we're talking about her. So Mary basically is a woman. She was obviously unfairly accused of being a witch. No one fairly accused of being a witch. Unfairly accused of being a witch. And she was burned at the stake. So, she always has sort of smoke billowing around her, and she's covered in soot. And what I find noteworthy about this character is she's the only one really who is traumatized. She's evidently traumatized by her death.
Yeah.
Like, they've all died, that's why they're here. But she clearly, she was burned at the stake by the people in her village. Like, she carries trauma.
Yeah, and I think, like you were saying, that Ghosts as a show does not shy away from having a bit of emotional hardness to it, and that's one of it. And for the most part, she is a sort of quite silly comedy character, and Katie Wicks does that very well. I think having an actor of that quality can really bring that out. But then it's there when you need it to really kind of hammer some stuff home.
Yeah.
When I pass through live-ins, they smells burn-ins.
Excellent. None of those are plural, but...
'Tis a most noxious stink soap.
Okay, let's go back to the episode. So we've seen Mary is sucked off, and the next scene, Alison is finding out. So we kind of, they're all processing what's just happened. And we are dealing with effectively the death of one of our characters here. You can argue about definitions of death, but for all intents and purposes, she's now gone and never coming back. And essentially what we now see is them all processing this and how they all deal with their grief. Meanwhile, we get the second half of the plot. So Mike comes in, Mike the husband who can't see the ghosts, and he's all excited because they've got a birthday party booked in the hotel, in the house today. We can see all the ghosts who are grieving. There's real upset in the room. He can't see any of that, so he just comes in, "Hey, party, party," and that's a nice example of the clash that we get a lot.
Who died? Who died?
Mike, it's Mary.
Mary? From the farm shop? She's like 35, hasn't she?
No, our Mary. Mary, she's moved on or passed over.
Oh, one that smells like toast. Spies on me in the bathroom. She's gone. Oh. Come here.
Should we talk a little bit about Mike and Kyle Smith-Bino?
Yeah. Yes, I'd like to talk about that and the relationship they have, Mike and Alison.
Yeah.
Because I think the Mike and Alison relationship is really central to the plot, and we see it immediately in this scene where where Mike pops in, is like, he's happy, realizes just by looking at Alison something's wrong. She says, basically tells him Mary has passed on and she's dead to all intents and purposes, and he doesn't understand, he doesn't know, he doesn't really get it, but he sees that she's upset. And so he's just very empathetic and sympathetic. He just comforts her. Yeah. And that is, like, this, the relationship that these two have is a very beautiful kind of pure relationship. And that's never really questioned. And I think that's nice. It kind of gives us this very solid heart at the center of everything we do. And the conflict goes on around them, and we get plenty of fuel from that. But those two together, it's like it's always solid. Tight. Yeah, and it means that Alison, who is essentially the central character, can be pushed and pulled from all different sides, and she's always got this support network. And, great performance from both of them. But with Kyle Smith-Bino, particularly, he's just a nice guy, and you always believe that he loves her unconditionally and doing whatever he can to support her.
He gets a lot of credit, Kyle Smith-Bino, I think, for his acting. All this activity going on around him. And he has to basically act as though he not only can he not see it, he can't hear it, he's oblivious to it all. It's quite a tough job, I think.
Yeah.
There's a couple of occasions on which he addresses the ghosts. So if there's any ghosts here, I need you to tell you such and such. When he tries to talk to the ghosts, and he always looks up in the air as if they're floating, and it becomes a bit of an in-joke. They're like, well, why is he looking up there? But I heard, I think it was on Richard Herring's podcast, the only reason he was looking up is because every time he looked at Jim Howick, he made him laugh. So he was just like, I've got an excuse to look in the air here. But then apparently they wrote that in later as a sort of plot point.
No, it's good. I like it. It's nice. I don't really know him from much else either. Well, he's in Staff Lets Flats. That's kind of the other main thing.
I wouldn't say I knew him particularly. Yeah, again, Staff Lets Flat, I knew him in that. I seen him in Taskmaster, which obviously is not an acting performance. It's him being him. And I've listened to quite a few interviews of him, like I say, Richard Herring and some others. And he seems like he's a very charismatic guy. He seems like a nice guy. He seems like he's got a lot of charisma. Mm-hmm. It seems like Mike is not a million miles away from his character,
Yeah, I must admit, I don't watch this show and go, wow, he's an amazing actor. We're really looking forward to seeing something else. He comes across as a nice guy, but it's not, and that's not, I don't want to dismiss it. I think he does a very good job. But yeah, it definitely seems to be more of a comedy improv sort of guy rather than a straight actor based on his work. Here's a Wikipedia fact for you. Take it for what it is. I don't know. I just read it on the Wikipedia page. Apparently the first person, he was the person who really popularized the phrase platijubes as shorthand for the Platinum Jubilee. He's on Twitter. His is the first use of that. So
that's interesting.
He's possibly responsible for it. I don't know. Just what a little piece of cultural history that is.
Why don't we talk about Charlotte Ritchie as well then? So we talked about this relationship between Mike and Alison. I think we've covered their characters. What about the actor who plays Alison, Charlotte Ritchie? She's been in some of the sitcoms previously, hasn't she?
Yeah, well, she started out in the biz as a singer in a group called All Angels, which is described on the internet as a classic crossover group. So it's kind of like they'd sing in classical music and stuff.
Is she as good as Samantha Janus?
Well, do you know what? It's a similar thing because these All Angels, I looked at them and this was like in 2006 or whatever, but they were all like 16, 17. They obviously just went to like the National Youth Theatre and went like, who have you got? We can exploit.
Is this post Charlotte Church?
Yeah. I think she's a bit earlier. But like they had a few hits and like they released some albums and stuff. Like they weren't exactly like the Spice Girls.
That's interesting.
It's not quite that
I didn't
thing.
know that.
But I don't know. It seems a bit weird to me. Why? Who's going like we need some 16-year-old girls to sing song? Like it just feels like that is deliberately finding people who are going to do what they're told and just sign whatever you tell them. And make all the money.
Yeah, definitely.
It just feels very gross.
It was a different time.
Anyway, so yeah, that was her start in the business. But yeah, she did eventually get into the acting. She was one of the leads in Fresh Meat.
Yeah.
which we talked about a little bit.
I didn't see Fresh Meat at the time. I've just watched a couple of episodes, for this, and I really enjoyed it. I've got it sort of on my to-do list to watch. I want to go back and watch it, I think.
Yeah, I dipped into it when we did In-Betweeners because Joe Thomas is in it. It was like the thing he did after In-Betweeners. And she'd also was in a show called Siblings.
Now, I have watched Siblings, Alan. Yeah. I watched all of Siblings, and it is... I really enjoyed it. It is definitely not a family-friendly sitcom. Mm. So it's a brother and sister, and they have this really messed up relationship, and they're both complete hedonists, and they just screw over everyone else around them. It's pretty it's really good fun, but like just really horrible people. The characters, it's good, enjoyable to watch.
Yeah, and then she was also in Call the Midwife for a while, which isn't a sitcom, but she's
Miranda
working,
was in it.
it's a bit, there's a bit of a comedy element to it. And then she was also in something called Feel Good at the same time as doing Ghost. So like she's basically still kind of doing it. But yeah, more sitcom pedigree than anyone else in the cast, basically. She was pretty well established despite still being fairly young.
Well, I think she's great in this. I think she's got that. She's the straight man in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. She's not doing the big comedy, but she's very good at that role, and she delivers emotion really well. She's an actor. You can tell she's an actor.
And we're going to see in this episode particularly something she has to do a lot, which is getting overwhelmed by everything around her and kind of trying not to show it to the outside world. I want to put it under the category of like emotionally overwhelmed single mother, like that kind of, it's like, oh god, I've got to do this, I've got to go and sort that out, and then so and so's, and now he's throwing his shoes in the pond, like all that kind of stuff. And like just going on with our, this is a kind of mismatched family dynamic. Ultimately, she's the one trying to hold everything together.
Let's go back to our episode. So in the next scene we have, essentially this is Pat comforting Kitty over the loss of their friend Mary. So let's contextualise it. So Pat is the scoutmaster. He's got an arrow through his neck, because that's obviously how he died. And Kitty's character is interesting. She's a sort of a young Renaissance woman who is very credulous, very sweet, cloyingly lovely, a little bit over the top, a little bit ramped up high. But she's very upset, and Pat's trying to comfort her. And so he sort of gives her a couple of platitudes, but then she jumps on these things that he's saying, and essentially it escalates so that he's just making stuff up. There's a funny thing where he's looking at the books on the bookcase and he's making stuff up. So she's comforted by it, and he's sort of gone in too deep to get back.
Kitty is the child of the group, and so when someone dies, you've got an 8-year-old kid, and like grandma dies or something. How do you explain it to them? And you it's very difficult to explain the brutal realities of the world, and so you kind of go, oh yeah, they've just passed on, they're in another place,
they've gone to heaven,
all that kind of stuff. So he's just doing that,
and then it gets out of hand, and 2,000 years later here we are.
But it's a nice little scene between them, and it kind of plays on throughout the rest of the episode as the consequences kind of fall out, and he has to ultimately face the truth.
Yeah, he walks it back.
Yeah.
But it works.
Yeah.
But I think it's a nice insight into these two characters. Let's look into these two characters. So let's start with Kitty, seeing as we've started with her. Like you say, she is the child of the group. And, in one of the episodes, we see the backstory. We get this a lot in Ghost. We'll have a sort of a flashback to the death of the character, and we learn a bit more about them and what makes them them. And yeah, she's been like bullied by her sister, but she always believes the best of her sister, and she won't have a word against her. Credulous is a good word, but again, she's optimistic. She only sees the best in people. She refuses to believe that anyone could be cynical or destructive.
And she's very naive but happy, and it's a very beautiful character in a lot of ways, and a real kind of, and it's a nice positive injection in the whole world. But can be just sickeningly annoying at times, but deliberately used for comedy.
Who's Florence, Kitty?
She was one of my best friends. I used to play hide and seek in the garden with my sister, and I was so good at hiding that often she couldn't find me for a whole day and night. I once got so hungry I had to eat a bit of my purse. Florence kept me company.
Oh, so you made a statue of her?
No, she is a statue.
She's very sweet and brilliantly played by Lolly Adefope.
She is brilliantly.
Like you say, it's big. It's a big, over-the-top kind of silly character, and I think you just need to get that dead right in order to make it work. And the one thing we get in Ghosts is like the performances are spot on, really. And you certainly could argue for your main six, they've written them for themselves. They've probably researched and kind of developed them themselves as well. With Katie Wicks and Lolly Adefope, how much they were involved in building the characters, I'm not quite sure. But we assume they were sort of at least established beforehand.
There's some great acting from Lolly Adefope, not just in, I don't mean in this scene particularly, but just generally there are some, you know, like you say, she's sort of cloying and simpering at times. But then there's an occasion where, it's one of the Christmas specials where there's a wedding and she wants to be a bridesmaid. And she's like, oh, can I be a bridesmaid? Please, please, please. And she like flips because she's so like, oh, I need this. And there's a real acting choice. And it's like, oh, she just got the character there. That's perfect.
So before watching this, I had actually seen her in other stuff. I'd seen her on Taskmaster as well as herself. But also...
She's a stand-up comedian, wasn't she, Lolly Adefope?
She was more of a stand-up, yeah.
I think she is, yeah.
Yeah, she does stand-up. But from what I understand, her stand-up is a bit more character comedy-based. Rather than, hey, I'm just here, I'm doing some gags. It's like, oh, here's my funny character of so-and-so and doing whatever it is. And she actually, from what I read, she tried and failed to get into drama school. And so kind of wandered into stand-up and sketch comedy instead, kind of went that journey.
I see.
And that's how she ended up in just popping up in comedy shows, and including Horrible Histories. So they obviously knew her from that. But I'd seen her in... This time with Alan Partridge, she's a sort of a regular small role in that, and a very, very different character. Like if you want to see an immediate kind of, she's got quite a range, because it's just.
I've seen her recently in. I mentioned earlier, Everyone Else Burns with Simon Bird about a religious cult. She plays one of the kids' teacher, who's like a normal person outside the cult, and she's great in that. Has she been in America? Has she done American things?
She did. She's done a show called Shrill, where she plays. From what I could tell from little I saw of it, she's like the best friend of the lead character. But like a major character within that show. So she's done a bit of that, going off to America, yeah.
Well, I think she's great.
She's also, prior to this, she was in a sitcom called Loaded in 2017, and Jim Howick was one of the leads in that. So again, just some little connections
so
there.
That's how they know it.
Yeah, possibly more connections there.
Well, you mentioned Jim Howick, so he's the other person in this scene, and I am tipping my hand now because I love Jim Howick. I think he's brilliant. I think he's a very funny man. I think he delivers this character so well, but he personifies the heart that underpins Ghosts. He is the emotion of the Ghosts. Yeah,
I don't think we're breaking new ground here, is it? He's my favourite character as well, and I suspect that's probably true for a lot of people. The character of Pat, first of all, like you say, he is the heart of it. He is just a thoroughly nice guy who always is doing the best for the people around him. Mm-hmm. But you don't lose his own character within that.
Yeah.
I think, though, the really interesting thing here is, and this might take us on a bit of a tangent, but the difference between history and nostalgia. By which I mean, these characters are placed in history, but two of them come from kind of living history, if you will.
Oh, yeah.
In terms of a general audience. So we have Pat, who is a 1980s Scoutmaster, and then Julian, who is an MP, mid-90s MP. We'll come back to him.
Yeah.
Because I don't think we have the same personal connection to Julian. But Pat, he is, like, for our generation, if I may speak for you as well...
And for their generation, the guys who wrote
and for the people who wrote this, he's the dad. He's our dad. He's
exactly
your dad. He's your Scoutmaster. He's a 1980s dad, Yorkshire man dad, and very simple, not complex kind of thing going on. For an older generation, it might be much more directly relatable. It might be like,
that's interesting.
I remember my kids when they were growing up, and I helped out with the Scouts or whatever. Maybe not that directly. But we see enough of his family life and background as it gets unfolded. We see he's got these two sons. He's got a marriage that is perhaps not quite as strong as it seemed at first glance. He seems to live this happy life. And we see that his children have grown up without him, but they've moved on and they've done okay and everything's all right. All that kind of stuff. But it's all things that we can directly relate to, and a character that we can relate to, in the sense that we can't relate to a woman who was burned at the stake during the witch trials.
It's interesting. You're dead right. I agree with all of that. The dad thing I hadn't thought about And I think he does act as the dad of the group. You know, he's not in charge, he's not the leader, but, you know, when there's conflict, he's the one who resolves it. When there's loss, when there's grief, he's the one who's trying to unite everyone and try and bring everyone together. He's the one who's trying to comfort Kitty in this situation.
Yeah. But he's not a stern father. He has a very distinctly playful side.
Yeah.
He yearns for food. That's the thing he misses in life. And just Jim Howick, just every line delivery is just perfect. It's just nails it.
Well, this episode obviously deals with grief, but even before, we're well into the 4th series here. Even before this, we have dealt with grief through Pat. Yeah. As you say, his is one of the more recent deaths. And so, yeah, his family are around, and we see them. They come back and visit the house to mark where their dad died, you know, and that's a really emotional scene. I've made a list here of the 9 episodes during which I cried. I cried on 9 times watching this. No, not 9 times. During 9 episodes. Some of those episodes more than once. And of those 9, 7 of them is Jim Howick that made me cry.
Yeah. I believe that. Yeah, definitely. There's a couple of episodes that really deal with his relationship with his lost relationship with his children. These, what are they, 10, 11 years old, these 2 sons he's left behind?
But then there's another episode where basically the kid that killed him. So the kid that shot the arrow that killed him.
Accidentally, obviously.
Accidentally, sure. But he's angry at first. He sees this kid and it brings back all his trauma. And at the end he forgives him, you know, and he wants him to move on with his life. And it's just because he's a good man. He's just a good man. Like we see his death scene. It's in the first series, one of the earliest flashbacks. And it's a really interesting scene because he gets hit in the neck with an arrow, right? And it's very difficult to do that without playing it for laughs.
I think, honestly, that scene, I've watched it about half a dozen times. It is an absolute masterpiece of physical comedy. It's funny.
Without going over the top.
Without losing the kind of, oh my God, this is a serious situation.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic...
And he says, the line, Alan, is this: "Don't look, boys, you don't want to see this in your dreams."
Wow.
And that was the first time I cried watching Ghosts. He's just the goodest man there is.
Oh, it's fantastic when he's trying to get his keys out to open the book.
Yeah.
Oh, it's amazing. That scene is
so good.
Brilliant.
It's so good.
I'm panicking. Right. Who can drive? We might need one of you to drive. No, it's a silly idea. You don't look at me, kids. Make a path. You don't want to see this in your dreams. Someone call Carl, please. You got to go New Forest next week. That's out. Oh, it's cold, isn't it?
So, little things I like about Pat, is he's got an arrow through his neck, obviously, the whole time. But it's through his neckerchief, with his little scout woggle neckerchief, because otherwise you would have to have all the makeup to make it look like it's through your neck every time.
Yeah,
so
it's very good.
That's just a thing you can probably slip on quite easily and just attach with a bit of glue or something. So I like that. Very practical.
Let's talk about Jim Howick then, because he's been in other stuff. Apart from the Horrible Histories stuff, he's one of those guys that when I'm watching old sitcoms, I'm like, oh, who's that young man? It's Jim Howick. You know, he turns up in little things. I'll tell you what I saw him in recently. He's in the Reggie Perrin remake, the Martin Clunes remake. He plays one of the office staff in that. Him and Nick Mohammed, actually.
Yeah. Like I said, this is the one where I didn't really recognise him when I was watching the show until I was watching some Armstrong and Miller and went, oh, and it all just suddenly clicked together. I was like, oh yeah, Peep Show.
Well, he was David Mitchell's nemesis in Peep Show, wasn't he?
Yeah. And he was in Sex Education as well. He was.
Oh yeah.
He was
I watched that. I mean, that's not a sitcom as such, but I watched that. I think that's a really good show, and he was great in that. I tell you, he's also in The Change, the Bridget Christie show recently. Oh, yeah. In the supporting cast of that, and he was really good in that. He sort of plays a frustrated men's rights activist who it would be very easy to be an unsympathetic character, but he brings some pathos to it that makes him. Well, pathetic, but a sort of a lovable character rather than a hate figure. Yeah, it's a great balancing act. It's a great acting.
And then his most recent thing is Here We Go.
I've watched that. I watched that. Well, it was originally a post-COVID sitcom, so the first series they're in lockdown, and it's a family sitcom, completely dysfunctional family, little bit cartoonish, but just the right side of that, and it worked really well. If you want to go and watch one episode, I would recommend the episode that Tim Key is in. The passive-aggressive acting between Jim Howick and Tim Key is absolutely marvellous. It's a great episode.
And I'm afraid that's all we have time for this week. But do come back next time where we will carry on this discussion. We'll look at all the other actors, look at the ending of Ghost as well. Spoilers abound. Yes, but in the meantime, why not come and have a chat with us over on the social medias? We're on Instagram, that's @BritcomPod, and we're on Facebook. Search for British Sitcom History Podcast to find us on there. Seems to be where most of the comments get made, so that's a nice little discussion place on Facebook there. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you next time.